Okay, we are recording. Okay. So I'm just going to invite all of those who are listening and Katherine, and as well as myself, to start off with some orientating, which is a somatic experiencing exercise to help bring us into the present moment. And so all we do is just let our eyes gaze around the room. Of course, if you're driving, we want to make sure our eyes are on the road. And if you're driving, you can just take some nice deep breaths with us while we're looking around the room. And again, letting the eyes move you versus you looking for something to look at. What do the eyes get curious about? And as you're looking around your room or taking some deep breaths, just start to notice what happens with the body, what happens with the breath, what happens with the mind. And just also notice if there's anything in particular that your eyes are really drawn to. And maybe just get curious about why your eyes are drawn to that particular thing. And now I'll invite you to close your eyes and take some nice deep breaths with me. Exhaling through the mouth if you feel like you need to clear excess energy, or exhaling through the nose if you feel like you need to contain your energy for the day or the evening or whatever time it is for you. Feel the earth beneath you and the sky above you. And feel all that exists in nature exists within you. A few more deep breaths. And Katherine and I are going to become present with our breaths. But if you're cleaning your house or going for a walk, or again, if you're driving, just allow that sense of awareness to come closer to your body so that you become present with this conversation that we're about to have and just present with what your task is at hand. Take one more big, big breath. If your eyes are closed, allow them to open. Hi.
That was nice.
Yeah, I feel better. So let's start off with a quote that you have that you're working with now, or one that's been really inspiring to you.
I have two technically. They're very different though. So the one that has really inspired me was said to me by my teacher and counselor from my previous counseling school. It was a very experiential school, transpersonally based. It was sort of a combination of A Course in Miracles it was a psycho-spiritual approach to healing. Duane and Katherine O'Kane are the founders of the school, and they're both clinical counselors in BC. And I've seen both of them. And Duane once said to me, "Your ego only knows how to respond in the way it did when you hired it."
Right.
Yeah.
I like that.
And it just, I think of it often because I feel like it explains so much of our patterns. Mm-hmm. And when I get into my habitual patterns, relationship patterns and ways of being in relationship with myself and the world, when things happen and I make them mean something they don't, as a result of where I've been in my own life and, and other experiences in my family of origin as a child, I remember that and I go, oh yeah, well, what am I making this mean about myself? Is it true? Mm-hmm. And, how did I respond back then? Of course I was going to think the world was unsafe, and it gives me that space to really, make a different choice and really hold that little girl in me and that part of myself that needed that love and compassion, when I was little. So
Great.
it was, that's.
Can you say that one more time?
Mm-hmm. Your ego only knows how to respond in the way it did when you hired it.
Yeah.
And I always think of, this, that it just reminds me too of our innate innocence as human beings, and that slow process of building up the armor when things happen, creating beliefs about ourselves and creating, this world viscerally and cognitively, emotionally, in every way that corresponds with our environment and what we're learning about the world. So, definitely is one that feels very freeing to me.
Great. Thank you. And you said you had another one.
Yeah, this is a different one, and this is a good reminder for me. It was in a textbook actually for this current degree that I'm doing. It's super simple. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And super simple.
That creates a great visual.
yeah, doesn't it? And I chose that. I find that I think of that a lot. I think of that. I find that I'm using it in a lot of my courses, and I feel like it's sort of representative of the humility that I'm learning doing this degree and learning about things that I previously judged, like, Western psychological ways of thinking about things. And it also points to, I know for myself, I used to think that just because something worked for me, then that was the way, and I was going to you guys you need to do yoga and eat kale and everything, and just be positive and just all of these really kind of more surface level things, that thinking that, that I had the answer. And I think on a greater scale, that's kind of what happens with us in the world, as we think that because something worked for us and this must be the way. And it's really taught me to, I feel like my school has really taught me to continually step back and go, wait a second, maybe it's not that. Maybe you don't know what it means. Maybe a client walks in the room and you really, as therapists, as people that work with people who are hurting, just being open to their full experience. And not just saying, well, because I did this one training, that means that everything is going to fit into this template.
Right.
And I know that for myself, that's something that I really used to do and still catch myself doing, based on my experience and my trainings and ways of seeing things. And I think learning the scientific, elements of psychology science has actually really humbled me in realizing that, wow, there's so much I don't know, and it's so refreshing instead of, thinking that I know what's wrong with everybody. And so for me, that quote really resonates on a deep level.
Yeah, beautiful. So we got to know you just a little bit in what you were saying with those quotes. So obviously they're really powerful quotes for you, and they're great. And you mentioned that you've done that previous training, and now you're in the process of acquiring a degree. What degree are you acquiring?
I'm doing my master's degree in counseling psychology right now. And it's my first foray into academic schooling. Good word, I know. In a really long time, and traditional schooling. And it's challenged just about every preconceived notion I had, and has just, it's really opened up a lot for me in terms of the way that I think about things, and really, really healing old school experiences too, which were never positive. They were always, I was always by myself in the desk at the corner in elementary school. I was always in trouble. I almost failed out of high school. Then I almost failed out of my undergrad and university. And just, I had so much going on. And so to come back and be embraced and to do well and to constantly be bumping into that part of myself, it's like, I can't do this. I can't tell you how liberating that's been. So it's been a really good experience.
Cool. And it sounds like you mentioned you've had those parts of yourself that you're bumping up against. It sounds like maybe your schooling before was a little bit hard for you for many reasons. Do you mind sharing a little bit about sort of the trauma that you had around that, or just anything that was going on at home that made it harder for you to be in school, and maybe that possibly influenced you to be taking this route of psychology and helping people and supporting people in this way?
Oh yeah.
I think that's like common for most people who get into this. We all have something that brought us to this place. I don't know very many therapists who haven't had something that they've.
Yeah, it's sort of not like, hey, should I be a civil engineer or hold people in their traumatic experiences? It's not, typically we're here for a reason. Yeah. I grew up in a house where there was no problem without a chemical solution, basically. And, my mom was a nurse. She taught nursing. And everything was very, based sort of on that idea of like that linear kind of cause and effect that I think we're slowly growing out of as a culture, but we're still in very much, this causes this, therefore, diagnosis, therefore medication, or, and because I had been diagnosed with ADHD, so I was on Ritalin when I was young, not super young. I think I was 10, maybe 11. And just the way that our family system was oriented, basically we numbed out a lot. So, even before then, I remember, my mom just being the nurse she was, just, just take it, and taking T3s when I was like way too young. And I just always remember being numbed out, and then Ritalin and going to school and having, and just being on this drug all day. I never felt normal. And I really struggled with that. And I definitely developed a drinking problem. I did a lot of drugs too, but the drugs kind of came and went. It was more the drinking that was the constant, numbing out agent in my life. And that started when I was fairly young. My mom was alcoholic. That was sort of the big hidden secret in my family, that nobody ever talked about, because, I think, and again, it's changing, but I think addiction is still associated with, a certain socioeconomic class, or, if they can't hold down a job, and there's all of these things that are associated with it. But because I grew up in a middle class suburban family, nothing was ever suspected. And I learned to enable all of that crazy behavior and like the checking of the bottles. And our house was like World War III. Like it was a nightmare. I hated going home. And nobody knew. And I'm an only child, and we don't have much extended family. So we were very, when I look back now, I think we were very isolated. And I was very much a part of my parents' relationship. So emotionally, I became an adult quite young. Because we were making decisions, you know, about my mom, and there was this role reversal, and that happens, I think, in a lot of alcoholic families because everybody's affected. And it progressively, my mom's alcoholism got progressively worse and worse and worse. Until she retired from her job. She was a big career person, very successful in her job, drove a nice car and was very proud of it, and had this big closet full of, you know, it was insane. After she passed away, we were like, what are we going to do with all this stuff, you know? But that was very much a part of her own numbing out process too, when I look back. And her own perfectionism and her own way of thinking her way out of feeling and processing her own alcoholic upbringing. Her mom was alcoholic.
Right.
So it's just been kind of passed down the line. And she just, you know, she had so much, you know, crazy undiagnosed, you know, depression, anxiety, the whole nine, you know. And it just got progressively worse, and she went into treatment 3 or 4 different times, and and eventually it just got to a point where she was actually alcohol dependent, meaning she depended on it to live. Like she was drinking morning to night. You know, my dad was really suffering because he was equally in terrible shape. Like he had trained himself to not sleep in case she fell, and she broke her neck but didn't notice because she was so numb. And she went into the hospital for I think 1 year she went in like 10 times for detoxes, where we would just take her in. You'd have to cut off the drinking at a certain point until she would go into withdrawal, and then we would take her to the hospital. And it was always, a screaming fight, and just so many mixed, it was chaos.
Yeah.
And I just remember that feeling of relief that like, oh man, she's in the hospital. She's okay. She's on alcohol drip. Like she'll be okay for the week or whatever it was, And eventually, it came to a point where she did have, the odd period of sobriety too in there. But then she would always go back. And actually what happened when she died was I was living out here in BC, and she'd been sober for 6 weeks. So we decided I still remember talking to both my parents, like the classic mom on one phone, dad on the other, and you're talking. And she, she was like, I'm here. I'm good. A miracle happened. Like I went in for my last detox, withdrawal, horrendous, I want to die situation. And I didn't have withdrawal. It was like, spirit came in and just saved me. And she felt different. And so I booked a flight home, and by the time I got home, she started drinking again. And that week she died. She fell and hit her head. And she was, we didn't know what else to do. We called her AA sponsor, and we just got to a point, quite often I would walk into the situation where, my dad and my mom, and I would walk in and go, you guys, like, this is like insane. Like, I don't know what to do here. I mean, this needs to stop, And so that night, we called her a taxi, and she went to a motel, and we just couldn't, there was nothing else we could do, you know, other than say, if you don't want to go for another detox, then you have to leave here tonight, because we can't. It was just to a point where it was survival, literally. You know, my dad looked like he was 80 years old, and it was just the amount of times that we'd gone through this over the years. So we did the right thing. But then the wrong thing happened, was she fell and she hit her head, and the maid found her in the morning. And we got a knock at the door from the police the next day saying her body had been found. Would we like to come down and identify her? That was definitely the hardest day of my life, for sure.
Yeah.
So that was, that was this, what happened to my mom, and it was really hard for me. I mean, that's such an understatement. This is like 10 years ago now. And I've done, just successive therapy and self-growth and all the rest. But for a really long time, I was acting out of those unhealed wounds, in my relationships and in my, my own addiction. I quit drinking for 6 years completely, and I reworked all of those things and really came face to face with my own, at the time, severe anxiety. And, I used to get really bad panic attacks consistently. And so to, move through all of that to the place I'm at now is a pretty big source of pride.
Yeah. And I think that's something that, good for you for being proud of that. That's a big journey. And your story speaks to so many things. It speaks to ancestral trauma. It speaks to, kids having, I think it's really common for kids growing up to have these issues at home that nobody knows about. And then out in the world where they're supposed to be performing in a certain way at school or at their jobs or whatever. And then they get labeled as these things, and we label ourselves as not being very academic or not being smart enough or not being able to concentrate, ADHD, all those things, when we have, those root causes of the trauma that we have in our childhood upbringing and at home. So
totally.
Yeah. And that really speaks to, I think, a bigger epidemic that so many of the teachers that I know we both follow speak about quite a bit, how there's this, diagnosis of symptoms versus cause. Yeah. And so around, this development of panic attacks and anxiety and your own addictions, was your mom's passing like your big wake up call, or did you have a big wake up call before then? Or did you have to, sometimes there's these wake up calls that are kind of like a rock bottom, but not really. Was there a place where you hit rock bottom, or just one day did you wake up and go, I need this to change?
I think my mom's passing, I mean, when I think about my life, I think there was sort of pre her passing and post her passing.
Okay.
And, when she passed, I really wasn't in a good place, but I didn't know that because that was all I knew. And I definitely feel that her passing was definitely a wake up call. And she, near the end of her life too, she really, her times of sobriety, she did yoga before I did. She handed me The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And I was like, Mom, what is this? Like, I remember calling me one time. She's like, you're not your mind, And I was panicking and stressing about some paper I had to write. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, so she kind of planted these little seeds before she left in me. And what happened for me when she died was, and I'm not sure, to be honest now, if it was just shock, but something opened for me, whether it was like a channel or, but I just remember, you know, I could feel this almost pure love for the first time. And I couldn't even go outside my house because and at the time I could only compare it to being high on drugs, is right. The honest truth. Yeah. And, you know, yeah, I just remember going outside and hearing the birds chirping, and it just felt like a new world for me. I felt very present. I felt awake. And I do know now that was partly shock because it slowly wore off. But that feeling always kind of stuck with me. And that fall after she passed away, I decided to, so I did my undergraduate degree in political science, thinking I was either going to go into law or I was going to be a politician. I couldn't decide. So yeah, right. Pretty good. And so I thought, well, you know what, I'm going to go to UBC and I'm going to just, you know, upgrade a little bit and see if I can see if I still like the stuff, you know? So I took a couple like economics courses and like some other politics course I'd already taken just to kind of, you know, get my brain back in the groove. And I'd moved to Vancouver and I was going to do this, you know? And every sign, like, it was like everything was just not pointing me in this sign. Like my car broke down before an exam. And then, you know, and I went to like buy this, I couldn't find this economics textbook anywhere, you know, and I went to the library and I went to the UBC bookstore and on top of the economics book pile that I found, there was a book on crystals. And I was like, oh, crystals. Yeah, I'm supposed to work with crystals. And I was getting all these signs and I was like, what's happening to me? Like, I have no idea what's going on, you know? So I ended up doing my Reiki course and you know, and really, you know, connecting with that part of myself. And then I realized, well, I don't really want to do this. Now I envision a different life for myself than I did. Okay, well, what does that look like, you know? And so I went to Chinese medicine school for 3 months. I lasted, and by then I'd already started therapy. So I was seeing a therapist in Whistler. My girlfriend's mom recommended me seeing her right after my mom died. And I was like, I'm fine. Like, no, I'm good. Like, it hasn't affected me, you know? And I went in and she said something that really triggered me. And she said a couple things that now I understand. But I stormed out. Like, nope, not doing this. I am good. Thank you very much, you know? But she planted this seed. And so a year later, I went back and I started seeing her and I committed to working through, you know, my goal was to get to the root of my anxiety and to feel it. And she actually helped me quit drinking. But I know your question was more about, you know, if there was like a low point. And yes, there was.
well, both. I mean, yeah, like, so I think we can have multiple like changes and low points and things. And it sounds like your mom's passing was definitely a huge like trigger for a life change. But and so yeah, maybe tell us about this other low point that you had, or multiple low points that push us in different directions.
Yeah. Well, it was funny. I was thinking about that last night. I'm like, geez, I can think of about 5.
I think I've got like 10.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
For sure. Yeah, definitely because I was so numb,
mm-hmm.
I was so divorced from myself. I wasn't able to ever, of course, my relationships reflected that. And I was never able to really show up and be vulnerable because I had never learned how. So the way that I used to do relationship was, I think back now and it's like, it makes sense given the tools that I had and given, that I was basically walking around looking at life through these filters I didn't know I had. But I really struggled with being faithful in relationships. And I slept around. And I really didn't have any boundaries with what was right and what was wrong. Like I really, I objectified men through my 20s. And, I always had a boyfriend and they always kind of just, melt into each other a little bit. So I always kind of had that person to reinforce whatever was happening. And there was definitely one instance where I screwed up big time. And I remember I got an email and I remember reading it. I was really hungover. And I remember sitting in my apartment and I just thought, okay, I'm done. This is it, And the next week was actually when I decided I was going to not drink anymore. And I had support in that with the therapist that I was seeing. But I definitely, that was also the week before massage school started and before I decided I was going to do yoga every day. I'd never done it before, but I was going to do it every day because that's how, type A's work, right? We're going to do it, So that was sort of my, I guess, that was a big one. I definitely being caught in the middle of somebody else's relationship, having, inserted myself there and in this place where I somehow thought that was okay, where I was so numb to, my own well-being, the well-being of others, and just realizing that this, this isn't, I need to get underneath this, like what's happening, what's driving this.
Right. You seem to have a natural, so when I'm working with women, a lot of the work I do in the beginning is to get them back in touch with parts of their intuition, whether it's their physical intuition, emotional intuition. And it seems to me like, from what I've heard, maybe not when you were really little, but around maybe when your mom passed, you were able to now listen to your intuition. Like when you were at that bookstore and you saw the book with crystals. And do you feel like that was a natural thing for you to just happen? Because I know in trauma, that usually gets shut down, especially if there's been physical trauma. We'll have a really hard time listening to our physical intuition. Or if we've had emotional trauma, it's hard to listen to our emotional intuition. And so do you feel like that was a natural thing for you to just, like, it just started happening? Or do you feel like, those little seeds that were maybe planted by your mom or other instances or interactions with people sort of inspired you to start listening? Because I think there's not one person I've talked to or read about that some part of them, no matter how deep they are in their addiction or how deep they are in their anxiety or depression or whatever it is that their symptoms are from the trauma they've experienced, there's always a part of them that doesn't want to be there. But I think there's a deeper, when I speak about intuition, it's like that guiding force of like, oh, maybe you should look at crystals instead of economics. And you're like, oh, so I'm just, I'm curious because I know that for some of us, it's easier access than others because of certain life has presented that with us a little bit. So I'm just a little bit curious about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in some ways, I want to say that it just presented itself to me after she passed. Like, in some ways, I definitely, you know, I was lucky in that I had other resources, like really good friends. You know, my dad and I had a really close relationship. You know, there were certain other things in my life that were there, that I think supported me to be growing, you know, in the way that I did, and like to the best of my ability at the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's an interesting question, because I feel like sometimes when, and it goes back to that first quote that I had there, you know, so many times I thought I was listening to like my intuition or a gut feeling, and I was so sure that I was right, but it actually was leading me astray. It was actually leading me back into like the same old pattern. I know what this means. Oh, it's just this horrible loneliness or sadness, or and it took me, and I continue sometimes to get confused as to which it is. If it's truly my gut feeling, my higher self, which has my best interest in mind, or if it's an old feeling of like, I know this feeling, you know, I'm just going to listen to that feeling. And for a lot of times I did, and I was a gypsy for years, you know, because it was like, oh, I have that feeling again. Like, I know this isn't going to work with this guy, or I know that, oh, look at that, it's April, let her go, you know, don't have to commit to anything. And I moved twice a year for like 5 years. You know, it was typically between the same two towns, but that was sort of my out.
Right.
And I believed at the time that I was just a free spirit, and that I was just listening to my intuition. So, yeah, you know, I think that it wasn't until I did a lot of family of origin work and really delved deep into my family system. And, you know, we have to write these, at my old school, we had to write these big autobiographies, and going through all these different things and like what we made them mean, and really bringing a lot of awareness to that I was able to see that maybe what I believed was my gut feeling maybe wasn't. Maybe it was just a feeling. Feelings aren't facts, right? I have a feeling that, you know, this isn't safe, or I have a feeling. And so for me, that really that confused me.
Right.
As to what is my gut feeling.
Right.
About something, and can I trust it?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know that I necessarily have an answer to that, but
yeah, it's definitely one that I'm still exploring with myself, because one thing I'm exploring with my clients and with myself is that when there's a trauma in our lives, our sort of empathic abilities, so to speak, go on like overload. You know, they're like, they make us hyper aware of everything so that we can protect ourselves, right? So, and in that we gain access to our intuition, but we have so many old parts of ourselves acting in ways of protecting that they can kind of go, whoop, we're going to do, like, your intuition might be here, and this piece just comes in really quick and goes, no, we're not going there, you know, because we need to stay safe. So it's an interesting thing for me to explore. And so I'm just curious about it. And I don't think I have a definite answer for myself if I were to be asked that question either. It's just a point of curiosity how we, I think, culturally have shut down our intuitions to not feel, you know, it's got to be logical for it to be okay. And those moments when you're like, economics, illogical, crystal healing, not so logical. We look at those moments and those little pieces I think are really beautiful to just become aware of, that we do have, our intuition is working, whether we know how to really listen to it or not, and when to use it and when not to use it. I have this quote that I think speaks to intuition in our mind of like, if our life was an ocean and we were a boat, the heart is the compass, and our mind is the oars that get us there,
Yes.
And so for me, that's very much what, when I am exploring my own intuition and working with people, is like, what's your heart asking? And your heart is the center of our being, so it's very much connected to our physical, our emotional, our mental. And so I'm always curious about that with women who've been through trauma in particular, because women have such great access to our intuition,
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I just, first, before we go any further, I just want to thank you for sharing so vulnerably about your story and being so open to sharing, those really hard moments. I really believe our stories are medicine, and it really shows how much work you've done and the dedication and devotion you have to your own healing for you to be able to share openly about your story. So I just want to thank you for sharing. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah. And so just as we wind down here, do you have any sort of idea? I know we kind of talked about this right before we started recording, but do you have any sort of idea around, with your work and everything that you're studying, where you want, like, any direction that you want to go in, whether that be, working with men and women, or if there's a certain area within the very large scope that we can work with? Do you have any, I know you said you're still kind of gathering the ideas, but do you have any sort of insight around that?
I do. I definitely want to work with men and women.
Mm-hmm.
After I finish this degree, I definitely want to, focus more, take either, I'm trying to decide between sensory motor psychotherapy or somatic experiencing. I've been reading more about EMDR, different ways that see the body as an adaptive, purposeful tool, whereas like everything happens for a reason. And emotionally, I feel that way too. We all show up. We're all just doing the best we can with what we know,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as far as sort of a focus, I definitely want to work with people who want to help themselves and are ready to, do the collaborative nature of the work that counseling and therapy, it has at its foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And just helping people find their own answers,
mm-hmm.
and their own, holding people in their vulnerability and helping them remember their own innocence, I think,
mm-hmm.
is something that sometimes gets left out of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Anxiety, depression, but I mean, for me, to me, everything it's all childhood.
Mm-hmm.
It's all old and it's in there, and it's why a holistic approach is important. We can talk about things cognitively. We can talk about the story. If I would have just told you all of that, I wouldn't have been able to, had I not done the body work and the mind work.
Yeah.
Personally, for me, that's what worked for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, now there's boatloads of neuroscience that show, like, hey, wait a second, guys, maybe things do live in there. Well, yeah, duh, right? But it's, I definitely see working with the whole person.
Mm-hmm.
and really, getting to helping people find the root of what's underneath,
Mm-hmm.
not just, managing or, symptom reduction, or, I mean, that might be a first step, and it is a first step for a lot of people. Just like some people aren't ready for mindfulness, somatic mindfulness, you really have to, each client will be different.
Yeah.
Everyone has a different baseline, a different starting point. But yeah, that will be, I think, the nature of my work.
Beautiful. Great. Well, we look forward to following up with you in a couple of years once you're all done with your school and check in with you. So 2 things I'd like to close with. Well, one will be a resource, which I'll ask you, or a book or a resource for people, but women in particular. But also I'd like to, because you have, our personal growth and healing is a lifetime journey, but you've sort of been way down and now you're on this other side and you've sort of come through and you're really starting to just live the life that you feel you're meant to live. And you've done a boatload of work and really worked through a lot of like the harder stuff so that you can, live your life the way you live it now. If you could speak to women who are just starting that journey, where maybe they're like, okay, I'm ready to do something, or they're sort of in the midst of their chaos or in the midst of, being in their low point, if you could offer them a seed, as you said, like to plant a seed for them, what would that be? What would you say to them?
Wow. I would say first and foremost that it's okay to ask for help, and you're not alone with this. I think that's such a, people that I've spoken with over the years and clients, and that's sort of the fear that, I'm feeling this and I can't share it because, I learned over a 15-year period, vulnerability doesn't, it's just not an available resource. Yeah, don't be afraid to ask for help, and that, you don't have to do it all overnight.
Yes.
It's one step at a time.
Yeah.
And one little step towards, like, in the direction is enough.
Yes.
Yeah. And that you're already enough as you are, flawed and, imperfectly perfect. And that you got this. It's just a matter of putting all those little steps together, and slowly things will change.
Beautiful. I like that, one step at a time, even if it's a little shuffle. Yeah. Great. Okay. So is there any book or resource that you'd like to offer the She Will Rise community to support them along in their journey, or something that has supported you in your journey? Well, obviously it supported you if you're offering it as a resource, but yeah.
Yeah, it's I was looking at my bookshelf and I couldn't decide. But I chose a book. It's by Laurence and Aline LaPierre, and it's called Healing Developmental Trauma: How Early Trauma Affects Self-Regulation, Self-Image, and the Capacity for Relationship. And to me, that book, they're both somatic experiencing practitioners who wanted to do a bit more in like the developmental trauma realm. And their way of looking at the whole person really resonates with me, resonates with how I see human development, basically, and how I see pain, and how I see the role of all aspects of the body and the mind, and into how that manifests, basically. And I've listened to a couple of their podcasts too, and they're both wonderful. wonderful therapists in the US. And their book just goes through the different ways of masking pain and our adaptive survival mechanisms when we're kids to, oh my God, like, how do I get the love back? What do I do here? What's my strategy? And putting on that, that sort of way of coping, and the different ways of, that we show up, and we essentially also shut down the rest of ourselves. But, maybe I'll be lovable if I do really well in school. Maybe I'll be lovable if I'm a good athlete, or, and that's very much in line with my old counseling school too, and just really looking at family of origin beliefs and lessons being passed down. So it's a great book.
Great. Sounds great. I haven't read that one yet. I'm excited. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today about all of this. And it was a great chat. I really enjoyed hearing more about you and learning more about you, even though we've been friends for a while now. So I just really appreciate all the work that you're doing and your willingness to show up and your devotion to your own self-growth. I think that's, paramount, especially as we step in to being in a more therapist type role. So thanks very much. And we'll catch up with you soon.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. That was great. Yeah. Okay.